Next witness is Mr. York-Smith.
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly declare,
and affirm that the evidence I shall give
the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
Sorry about the timing of this evidence session, Mr. York-Smith. Not that you've got anything else on this week.
It's a very quiet week.
Thank you. Mr. York-Smith, you have provided a witness statement to this module of the inquiry, and the reference for that is INQ 000588227. That's your personal statement, and I think you're also a signatory to a corporate statement as well. But we're focusing on the personal statement principally today. And you've given evidence to the inquiry previously, so you're familiar with the process. Just a little bit of background, if I may. You joined the Treasury a long time ago from HMRC, is that right?
That's right-ish, yes.
Yeah.
HMRC didn't exist at the time, but its predecessor departments, yes.
Thank you. And so you'd been at the Treasury during the financial crisis in 2008?
Yes.
And you were still at the Treasury at the time of the COVID pandemic?
Yes.
At the start of the pandemic, is it right that you were the director of the Strategy, Planning and Budget Group?
Yes, that's correct.
And for how long had you been fulfilling that role? Can you remember?
Slightly under 2 years. So I started in April 2018.
Yeah. And we understand that during the pandemic, you also assumed the role of director of the COVID-19 response team within the Treasury. Is that right?
So the COVID-19 response team was a team within the Strategy, Planning and Budget Group. But as the director of that group, I was responsible for that team as well as the other teams in the group.
Yeah. And so, as I say, you assumed responsibility for it effectively.
Yes.
Yeah. And to have a little bit of context, we know that the Chancellor of the Exchequer had himself been in post only since the 14th of February, and there was a budget scheduled for March of that year.
Yes, that's right.
Right. And in normal times, the Strategy, Planning and Budget Group, I'm just going to ask if we could put up INQ 000588226, page 9 of it, paragraph 26. There we go. And this describes the group as sitting at the heart of the Treasury and leading on the department's overall strategy, resourcing and prioritisation. It's the Treasury's central coordination function. Sets strategic direction or assists in doing that. Brings together the department's objectives into a coherent strategy, and then oversees the budget and other fiscal events. Is that a fair summary of the role at the time of that group?
Yes, that's fair.
Yeah. And so before the pandemic, you were focusing presumably on preparing the budget that was a scheduled event.
Yes, yeah, and it would have been the first budget for over a year, because in 2019 there was no budget, so it was a significant budget.
Yeah, okay. And you were director of that group and then became the director of the COVID response team. And you used the term in your statement that team evolved naturally from the team that was coordinating the budget. Is that right?
Yes.
And I just want to understand what you mean by that. That it just evolved naturally rather than being something that was stood up. I mean, it wouldn't be stood up under the name of COVID response team, but how did it come about?
So the budget director role, and the budget was the biggest thing that I was responsible for, seeks to bring together the whole of the Treasury, where you have lots of different teams working on different tax policies, spending policies, fiscal policies, to allow the Chancellor to make lots and lots of decisions, for those decisions to be presented consistently and effectively, to think about the implementation, the legislation which flows from it, and to give him a picture across the whole of the Treasury's policy for those events. When Rishi Sunak became Chancellor, shortly after he became Chancellor, he requested for the budget policies to respond to the emerging coronavirus. Given that those policies cut across public spending, across welfare, and across support for businesses, and that didn't have a natural home in any one part of the Treasury, because all of those functions are separate, I took responsibility for trying to bring together those policies, and I used part of the strategy planning and budget group is a flexible pool of staff who can be deployed to emerging policy issues. It's a thing which was a result of the review of the response to the financial crisis, building this core central resource that could be deployed to new and emerging areas quickly. And so I used part of that team, which I had oversight of, to coordinate the policy announcements which were ultimately made in the budget on the 11th of March, I think it was, which included support for public services, some welfare changes, and some tax changes. And the reason I say it evolved naturally was what the COVID response team was seeking to do was to fulfill a similar role of being a central contact point within the department to try and bring together what was a multifaceted economic response to the pandemic, which engaged every bit of the Treasury, ultimately. Every single team was in some way involved in the economic response. And so it was, the team had been coordinating for the budget. Very quickly after that budget, we moved into a world of non-pharmaceutical interventions, lockdowns, and so on. And given that it wasn't purely a health issue, it wasn't a spending issue, it wasn't a tax issue, it was all of those issues, it was agreed that I would just build up a team to respond to this and to continue to lead it for a period.
So it made sense, did it, to take members of a team that were already working in that central overview role rather than trying to stand something up from outside? That made sense.
Yes, although I would say that the people who form the core of the team were not working on the budget, but they were working for me and I was working on the budget. So the group had a culture and experience of doing that, but they were not necessarily, I didn't move people who had been working on the budget onto this. I actually drew on other bits of the department, this flexible team. I recruited 2 deputy directors to build the team and head the team. Very shortly after, I had put out an expression of interest process to set up the team on the day of the budget in order to move very quickly, because it was very clear at that point that the nature of the health crisis was changing very rapidly.
Yeah. So unpacking a little bit of that, the request to put something together came from the Chancellor, and the decision to deliver that by setting up this team came from you.
Yes, although me in consultation with my manager, who was the Director General for Tax and Welfare, and the Permanent Secretary at the time, Tom Scholar. So I suggested that it was the right thing to do, and they agreed. And we built, and actually, right at the very beginning, because I was so engaged in the budget, I asked Charles Roxburgh, who I know has provided a witness statement to this, and I think this module, and I think talks about it. I asked him to do some of the early convening because I was seeking to deliver the budget, and he had the authority to do that convening.
Okay. And so, although this team with that name was new, should we understand that this was the sort of team that it was envisaged could be stood up in a time of emergency, taking that learning from the previous financial crisis?
So I think it drew on some of the things which had been recommended as part of the response to the financial crisis. I think each economic crisis is different. And so the types of things that the Treasury had to do in response to the pandemic were quite different and engaged more teams in the department than the financial crisis, where there was a very strong focus on financial stability and the bits of the Treasury that were responsible for that, and fiscal policy, but I would say much less in terms of, so for example, when I try and think about how the pandemic changed the work of the Treasury and the extent to which we moved people around, if you were working on business tax, when the pandemic happened, you were just doing business tax with respect to the pandemic. There was no other policy development happening. Whereas I think in the financial crisis, that was not true of as many parts of the department. So the idea of having this central coordination team is not a thing that I think was a lesson from the pandemic. The idea of having the flexible resource which I used to create that team was a thing which was part of the response to the financial crisis.
You mentioned there financial stability, and the Treasury had a financial stability directorate, is that right?
Yes.
And that directorate, was that engaged in pandemic preparedness generally?
So I believe they were. They do a lot of crisis management, and they're very well exercised, and they have a list of reservists for financial stability matters, which was one of the recommendations after the financial crisis. It's not a thing. Sorry.
No, I just want to jump in and pick up on that as you mention it, rather than try and come back to it later. This idea of reservists, as you say, that reservists are people, as we understand it, individuals who've participated in dress rehearsals for future financial crises, is that right? And are ready to step in to offer that stability?
I think it's probably, this was not my area of responsibility, so I will say what I understand to be the case, but I think it's not that they have necessarily been involved in exercises, but they have experience of working on financial stability, and in the event of a financial stability crisis, they could therefore be drawn upon because there is a significant amount of expertise needed to properly think about financial stability and the appropriate interventions. So I'm not sure it's totally that they have all been exercised, it's just they have in the past worked in that area, so if there's a need to significantly expand, they could be recalled.
Were you a reservist, as it's termed?
No.
No,
I've not. My background has been tax and welfare policy primarily.
Okay. Looking at that then, do you know why the Financial Stability Directorate, which exists to ensure financial stability in a time of crisis, was not the body that was leading on the COVID response to the Treasury?
So they were involved because there were concerns about financial stability, but what they led on was specifically about the stability of the banking system and the financial system. That was a part of the impact of the pandemic, but that was quite a small part of the impact of the pandemic compared to the impact on employment, on the cost of public services, the public health response, so and the economic cost of it. So I don't think it would be they would be experienced with part of the response, but not the rest of the response.
Okay, so we should understand then that financial stability, or the Financial Stability Directorate, is a very specific thing that's focusing on the sort of existential threat to the financial system.
Yes.
In a time of financial crisis.
Yes.
Rather than thinking about it as having a wider economic remit in the time of any emergency.
Yes, that's correct.
Right, understood. So that's why it wouldn't be a natural fit for them to take over, because they had a much narrower focus.
Yes.
Okay. Now, we know that in 2021, the Treasury undertook what was termed a corporate memory project, essentially to record events from the memory of people who were there on the ground in the Treasury, and to try and identify immediate lessons that could be learned. And we understand that was led by a deputy director and authored by a researcher. Number 10, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. And a number of officials were interviewed for that project, and that included that yourself. Is that right?
Yes.
And one of the things that you said in your interview, I asked for it to be put up. It's INQ 000652988, page 1. There we are. Is that there wasn't a natural home for these policies. These were policies to respond to COVID in the budget. So Dan asked someone for the SPB to coordinate advice. What did you mean by that phrase? There wasn't a natural home for those sorts of policies within the pre-existing structures.
So it's partly what I've already mentioned, that the Chancellor, the budget announcements ultimately involved an increase in public spending to support a sort of preemptive increase in public spending for the NHS. It involved changes to statutory sick pay. It involved changes to business rates, grants for businesses, additional flexibilities on the time that businesses had to pay their tax. Those sit across probably half a dozen different policy teams in different parts of the Treasury. And what the Chancellor wanted was a single piece of advice on all of the things that he could do. Therefore, that was why I judged the appropriate place, given that it was also part of the budget, that one of the teams in my group should synthesise and bring that all together and say, here are all of your options from all the different teams in the Treasury, rather than each individual team seeking to write their own advice, and not necessarily being able to recognise whether there were gaps. So the Chancellor had set out the types of things that he was concerned about, and someone needed to say, OK, if these are the types of things, what policy does this team have which might be appropriate? OK, thank you. And how does that fit with this team's advice? And are they sufficient in scale? Are there things that we should be thinking about that we're not? And I think in later, actually the next bullet point in this, one of my concerns was there was insufficient ambition of some of these, given what the Chancellor was asking for. So I was asking other senior people in the department to push their teams to think about additional things that could be done, and so on.
Okay, well, I'll come on to the next bullet, but just to continue on that answer you've just given, did you therefore think that there was a need to have a holistic response? In other words, bring together advice in one place for the Chancellor, rather than looking at teams in silos who could provide their own advice that might not necessarily be joined up advice? Yes, yeah,
exactly. And there wasn't, because each individual director would know about their area, and in a sense this was a microcosm of the budget process, where chancellors seek to include a mix of different policies with different objectives and how they all fit together, and also because they would then subsequently be announced in the budget, and my team led on the production of all the documents and all the rest of it.
And would you say that was really stepping outside ordinary Treasury operating procedure and acting with some agility to set up that sort of cross-cutting body?
I think it was agile in the circumstances, but was also very much in keeping with the type of thing that the teams that worked for me did, because any budget involves a mix of policies on tax, spending, welfare, and someone needs to say, how do these all fit together? And what does the economic advice say? What does the public finances advice say? How do you implement it? How do you legislate for it? So it was a natural, I think there wasn't a natural home for that activity, except for where the natural home for it was for budgets, which was in the group that I led.
Okay, because in a budget, the Chancellor needs to receive, again, that sort of joined up advice, rather than advice from this section and that section and that section.
Yes.
Right, understood. So looking on at the bullet points, let's pick up that next one. Dan noted that this advice was cautious. Claire, that's Claire Lombardelli, presumably.
Yes.
Rang him on a Thursday evening to say the advice had to be much bigger. So let's just look at that. The advice was cautious. What, the advice to the Chancellor? What advice were you talking about there?
So the advice that was coming from individual teams to then be brought together was, I I mean, as far as I can recall, it was about the scale of the response. And ultimately, we ended up, I think the budget package was sort of just above 10 billion. It was double-digit billion, which very quickly, by the following week, had been eclipsed multiple times. But at the time, in the context of a budget, that was a very big set of interventions. And I think because the progress of the health side of the disease at that point was not well understood, people were being cautious and worrying about the cost of things, the practicalities. And I think the view from Claire Lombardelli, who was the chief economic advisor, was there was a need to be more decisive and to offer and to give the Chancellor options to do larger interventions, given how, this was maybe a couple of weeks before the budget, given the news that was beginning to emerge about what was happening in China and possibly in Italy at that point. I can't quite remember the chronology, but...
So this was really an acceptance that you were going to have to at least think bigger in case much larger measures were needed.
Yes.
And you were doing that at an early stage and pushing back to those teams and saying, no, this is fine in ordinary times, but we need to think bigger.
Yes.
Right. And then we see underneath that, Dan tried to get other directors to be responsible for elements of the policy. This didn't quite work out. Can you just help us with that in terms of what you were trying to achieve and what didn't work out?
I think it was particularly around some of the health response and whether, given up to this point, and I think I detail some of this in my written evidence, up until mid-March when I established the COVID response team, most of the engagement on the emerging pandemic had been led from the health and economics groups, the health team and economics groups. And I think because my recollection is this was a very big budget, we'd have had a change of Chancellor a matter of weeks before, and it was quite a thing to get him comfortable with the decisions that he was making and support him to make those decisions. And given there was already a bit of pre-existing expertise, I tested whether it was possible for more of this coordination to be done from the health side of the health spending side of the Treasury. Ultimately, that didn't work, including because, as I say, we ended up announcing quite a lot of welfare and tax policies, which that director would have had limited knowledge of.
Yeah. When this team was stood up under you, was it generally known in the Treasury that structure was then in place?
Yes.
And was it generally understood that your team would be the conduit for advice to the Chancellor on the pandemic response from that point onwards?
Yes, although I would say that the role of the team did evolve a little bit. Given the volume of advice that was going to the Chancellor, because the nature of the health restrictions changed very, very quickly after the budget. And most of the team's work was actually on the interface with the Cabinet Office, which at the start of March had a COVID-19 secretariat. Later in the year, that evolved into a task force. And it was as much about, at that point, the Cabinet Office were making lots and lots of different requests to lots of different parts of the Treasury, and it was very difficult to understand where the central policy from the Cabinet Office about the health restrictions was going in order to inform the policymakers. And so the team's role became very much about being able to help the team that was working on the furlough scheme, for example, understand the likely decision-making, path of decision-making and direction of decision-making on the health restrictions so that the economic support policy could be tailored to it. So I think there was still an element of trying to synthesize, but it was as much about being a point through which requests from the Cabinet Office or information about where they were going would go. A very early example, if I may, is when the decision was taken to close schools, there was people who were identified as key workers would be able to continue to send their children to school. There was not a list of who was a key worker that existed. at that point. And the Cabinet Office wanted Treasury views on the types of people that were necessary from an economic perspective to be designated key workers, in order that, for example, we didn't have an issue with payment systems, so people would still be able to pay for things because the people that maintain those would be able to attend work if they had children, because they would be able to take their children to school. So that was a thing where finding a way of asking lots of different Treasury teams, are there particular professions that are really important to the functioning of the economy, even with these restrictions? If they tried to come in to any other team, it would have been very difficult to get a single view. So the team that I had established led the process of going out to the whole of the Treasury and saying, OK, which are the professions that matter for the functioning of the economy.
So you were coordinating that response. You already had a pretty big job as director of the Strategy Planning and Budget Group, and you were planning a budget. And then you found yourself also running the COVID response team. I'm not suggesting for a moment you weren't up for the responsibility, but did that put significant strain on you at the time?
It was a very, very intense period, and it was very difficult, partly just because of the volume of information and the pace of the change. I think there is something about the fact that from the 15th or 16th of March, just before people were advised to work from home if they could, the sort of softer NPIs, that the whole work of the Treasury was on this. So in a sense, the budget was done. Yes, obviously it's difficult coming straight off the back of a budget, which is an intense process, but the only work that anyone in the Treasury was doing was in response to the pandemic. So I sort of think my other responsibilities fell away for that initial period. Where it became more complicated was as we moved towards the summer and the Chancellor was making announcements, the plan for jobs in the summer, and then in the autumn there was the winter economy plan, there was a spending review. That became more difficult to do both jobs, which is why I agreed that I would be replaced with my COVID responsibilities, because I was at that point properly doing two jobs.
So almost in the time of the most acute crisis, it didn't overload you, because everything else had stopped. There was nothing else to focus on. But then when you started to move back into a more business as usual, or trying to restart business as usual process with the other things of government and the Treasury to do and to deal with, then it became something that needed somebody else to step in and take over. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, that's exactly right.
Right. Did you think that you had the sufficient resource at the outset in your unit? That it was being taken seriously enough, that there was enough thought about how severe this shock could be?
I think we had the right resource at the time of the budget. We moved very quickly after the budget to bolster that. I think because it was such an unprecedented crisis, and the way the central decision-making about the thing which mattered most, which was the health restrictions, was changing so rapidly. With the benefit of hindsight, having more people would have been better, but I don't know that we would have understood what we needed to be doing, because what we needed to be doing was changing so quickly. We had people who came into the team and had to work on, for example, what the border policy would be, and to give an economic view on that, or to gather the information about what the economic impacts of different policies would be. That is not a thing that we've previously had to do, so it was hard to anticipate that would be a thing that someone would need to do, as it were. So it became it's a bit circular. I think there was so much work that obviously having more people across the whole of the Treasury would have been helpful, but it's very difficult to set your sort of budgeting policy for this. My main reflection is that we had learnt lessons from previous economic shocks, like after the EU referendum in the financial crisis, and we did move people a lot more quickly and a lot more effectively, where previously when we tried to move people in response to shocks, it sort of hadn't really stuck. This stuck. We had structures which worked.
Okay, thank you. I just want to pick up on something you said to the Corporate Memory Project. So this is INQ 000652988. It's page 6. There we are. you noted that the COVID team had been very effective, but then you said this: the thing to learn is moving quickly to identify someone who's responsible instead of allowing it to happen organically. So let's deal with that first of all. You've told us really that you assumed this responsibility, so it had happened organically for you. But you seem to be saying there that, next time there needs to be some more formality about this, or better planning. Can you just help us with what you were saying to the Memory Project?
I can't entirely recall why I said this at the time. I think you're probably right about what I meant, that we should take a conscious decision about who the lead person is. I would say that I think that has happened since the pandemic. So, for example, when there was the Russian invasion of Ukraine with the impact on energy prices, we did move more quickly to identify a lead director to be responsible for how we responded to that, and the various things that were announced by the previous government support households with the impact of energy prices. There was a much quicker. Obviously, that is a different type of economic shock, a bit narrower, but nevertheless, I think that lesson has been reflected on.
Okay. And then the rest of it, Dan also noted they'd underestimated the duration of the crisis, and this reflected in the need to refresh the resource and build resilience. Can you just help us with that part of the
yes,
quote?
And I think I covered this a little bit in my written evidence, but in February and even into early March of 2020, the understanding of the scientific advice was that this crisis might be something where there was a 3 or 4 month period over which lots of people were unwell and had to self-isolate for a 2-week period, and that after that 3 or 4 month period there would be population immunity. So the duration of the crisis was not well understood at that point. There was an expectation that it would move quite quickly, people would get sick, but not the severity of the disease was definitely not well understood at the point of the March 2020 budget, when we began to set up these structures and teams. Actually, as the pandemic progressed, people had particularly March and April was such an intense period for people designing the economic support schemes that we did need to rotate people, because people were working such long hours for such long periods that from a resilience perspective, we needed to have a bit of rotation.
So that's what you meant by refresh and resilience. It's having the ability to bring people in, rest them, and keep the team fresh and able to work under the pace that's required.
Exactly.
Okay. I appreciate that this is a question that has an element of hindsight about it, but we know that the team was set up on the weekend of the 14th or 15th of March. Looking back, would you have preferred that the team was in place earlier, that the work had started earlier than that weekend?
Yes, I think it would have been helpful to have had something earlier. It did sort of exist in outline a little bit before that. So when I forget the exact date, but I think it was late February when the previous section of my COVID corporate memory interview you went to, where I talked about coordinating that initial advice for the budget. That happened in late February. That did involve bringing in there was a deputy director who just returned from parental leave, who I asked to do some of this. There were a couple of people borrowed from elsewhere in the department, someone from the flexible project team that I had in my group. A lot of those people were then the core of the team, which formally came into existence immediately after the budget. So it had begun a little bit, but I think a lot of it was because of the development of how the Cabinet Office were approaching the policy making about social distancing restrictions, which did change very, very rapidly over the course of early March.
Yeah. I mean, you also say in your statement, we don't need to put it up, it's paragraph 56 for reference, but you say there that it would have been beneficial to have had more resource allocated to preparations at the outset. And again, there's always an element of hindsight about this, but it's really your reflection that if there was any failure to properly resource or stand it up earlier, it was that it was a reliance on the proposition that this would be over quite quickly, and there perhaps hadn't been enough of planning for the worst case scenario, but rather assuming it wouldn't be as bad as all that.
I think that is fair. The advice at the time did consider the reasonable worst case scenario that had been produced by the scientists, but that reasonable worst case scenario itself got significantly worse in early March, particularly immediately after the budget, where the weekend that you referred to, where I'd sort of appointed the 2 deputy directors to lead this team. That was the weekend where there was a change in the view about how far along the curve we were, and that more action needed to be taken much more quickly.
Okay, thank you. Can I move on a little to the initial economic response? And I just want to ask you some questions about how it all emerged, really. We know that you were providing economic advice to the Chancellor in February, 14th of February, 26th of February. All of that was caveated with lots of uncertainty about estimates and about the worst case scenario, as you've just said. Budget's then delivered on the 11th of March. I'm just setting this out for context for everybody. Budget delivered on the 11th of March. I think by that point, Italy had certainly had some lockdowns, so the situation in Europe was deteriorating. And I'm just going to ask that INQ 0006529888 goes up. This is pages 1 and 2. This is back to the memory project. At the bottom, right at the bottom of page 1. Your thinking at the time, Dan reflected that the day before the budget, he thought that this would last at least a few months, and the Treasury perception, in part impacted by limited case mortality rate information, was that this would be a temporary shock where people have to isolate at home for 2 weeks. I mean, did that reflect your thinking, that you were beginning to think yourself that there might be a disconnect between what might happen and what the Treasury was assuming would happen?
So it's difficult to properly recall exactly at what point I realised things were much worse than we had understood. Other than that, I do recall on the Sunday, which I believe was the 15th of March, being invited to a meeting in Downing Street, which the Chancellor hadn't been invited to try and...
Sorry, did you say hadn't?
Hadn't been invited
right.
to, no, which had a number of ministers and people from the Cabinet Office and from Downing Street. And that was, I think, the weekend where, as I previously said, the scientific advice about how the seriousness of the virus, but also how far it had progressed in terms of the case rate, changed significantly. And I think prior to that, particularly because how I understood the health advice had been, I think there are some other documents in the evidence proposal that you refer to from the 14th and later in February. Those were very much setting out this sort of picture that it would be a temporary shock. And I think even on the 15th, I realised it was more severe, but the duration was still not apparent.
Okay. I think we can pick up at that, actually. You mentioned this to the memory project. We just go down to page 2. It's the same INQ. I think that meeting at... there we are, Sunday, 15th of March. 2-hour meeting in the Cabinet room involving the Health Secretary, Chief Medical Officer, Chief Scientific Advisor. The Chancellor had not been invited to this, and Dan made a pitch that he should go, as this would have a significant impact on the economy. So do you know why the Chancellor wasn't invited to that?
I don't, I'm afraid.
I mean, did it surprise you at the time that the Chancellor wasn't at that sort of high-level meeting when the economy was obviously going to be affected to some extent?
Yes, I was concerned, and as I sort of set out to this corporate memory project, I thought someone from the Treasury needed to go because the issues being considered were so significant in terms of their economic impact.
But it had to be you asking to go rather than somebody from the Cabinet Office saying, it'd be a good idea to have the Treasury here.
Yes.
And if we just go down 3 bullet points, we see there Dan regularly attended, that bullet, if we could. Dan regularly attended and noted that the week commencing the 16th turned out to be a key week. In past on Monday, Dan had been working late and saw the PM announcement on Twitter on not going to work if you could avoid it, and to avoid going to pubs and restaurants. And then underneath that, at 10:15 p.m, Dan saw at 10:15 p.m. that Number 10 had briefed the newspapers that the Treasury would announce a support package of which nothing existed at the time. And this led to a frantic evening to pull together that package to support particularly affected sectors. So this was the Prime Minister announcing that people should avoid going to work, avoid going to pubs and restaurants. From your perspective as a Treasury man, I mean, presumably you thought that's inevitably going to have a significant effect on the economy.
Yes.
And did you find out about it on Twitter? That's the first you knew about it.
I don't fully recall, but I think that actually this is not a very accurate account. As far as I recall, what I discovered was that the suggestion that the Chancellor would the following day be announcing a significant package of economic support, where I think this write-up probably overstates. I don't think it's correct that nothing existed, because people were doing thinking. But I think the fact that there was going to be an announcement the following day was not something that had been pre-agreed.
Yeah. I mean, had the Treasury at 10:15 p.m. on that date, had the Treasury got its support package ready to announce the next morning?
No.
Did it exist in any worked-up way?
So my best recollection is that we gathered the following morning with the policy teams who had been thinking about particularly loans, and that was ultimately one of the biggest parts of the support announced the following day, but also some of the teams who had previously worked on policies for the budget on business rates and business grants, which were in effect extended. So the budget had announced a holiday or a complete holiday on business rates, but only for small and medium-sized properties. And on the 17th rather, it was extended to all retail, hospitality, and leisure properties in light of the instruction to avoid going to pubs and restaurants.
But I'm accepting that things were moving quickly. To announce a policy and a package at a time when it doesn't in fact exist in any worked-up way. I mean, did you think that was surprising?
With the benefit of hindsight, I actually don't, because things were moving so incredibly quickly that it was necessary for the policy making process to move as quickly. I think it was, obviously when I was giving this interview, I was reflecting on the fact that a better process would have been to agree that it was going to be announced before, that there would be a package before briefing that. But I think the fact that it happened at pace was not, with the benefit of hindsight, actually surprising, because the health restrictions were moving at such a pace.
And talking of moving at pace, and please don't think that I'm being critical by any of my questions, I'm just trying to understand your position, but talking of moving at pace, your team and the Treasury moved at incredible pace then after the 16th. Would you agree?
Yes. Yeah. The policy work in that week, which culminated in the announcement of the coronavirus, the furlough scheme. I can't fully remember what the CJRS stands for. Job.
Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme is what we've been calling it.
Yep.
But I hope that's right. But
that
that's
is
what
correct.
We've been calling it. But anyway, that was announced on the 20th of March.
Yes.
And the COVID corporate financing facility on the 17th of March. And so you have that announcement on the 16th, 15th, and then by the 20th, the job retention scheme is worked up and announced, and the financing facility on the 17th. I mean, that sort of agility in developing policy, was that unusual in government, full stop?
I think for the scale of intervention, yes. Government, in the pandemic, lots and lots of departments moved at incredible pace to develop policy. I think this is probably the largest number and size of policies at this pace that I've experienced in my time in the Treasury, and I think it is. I personally, I should point out that I personally was not responsible for any of the schemes. That was done by others. I was peripherally involved in helping to see how they all fitted together, but it was incredibly. It was an incredible response.
And that presumably involved having to suspend ordinary government operating systems and structures and freed up innovative thinking.
Yes, it was. There was a combination of things. I think there was a difference in risk appetite, recognising the consequences of not acting would be so significant. So there was a tolerance of higher levels of potential fraud and error, although at every point we sought to mitigate that as far as we could. There was a greater willingness to announce something and then to tweak it as necessary in response to situations that hadn't been envisaged or how particularly the health restrictions were progressing. But there was a willingness, given the circumstances and the alternative of not providing the support, to take a different risk appetite on a large number of elements of what would otherwise be good policy making.
I just want to pick up on that, the alternative of not taking these steps. I mean, what was the state of thinking in the Treasury? You're doing these things at incredible speed. You're taking risks and cutting across decisions that would normally take weeks or months to come to fruition. But what was the sense of what might happen if you didn't act with that speed and if you didn't deliver this sort of support quickly?
It's very, very significant worries about large-scale unemployment, the impacts that would have on people's living standards, poverty, large-scale business failure, and very significant lasting economic damage. And the biggest priority, and particularly as evidenced in the CJRS, was about preserving economically valuable links between firms and their workers, and that people losing their jobs and businesses failing because they were not allowed to open or not allowed to trade effectively because the government had restricted their ability to do so was the number one thing that we were worried about.
And I just want to ask if this also came into the thinking that the government was restricting people's ability to do these things and asking people to comply with those restrictions. Was the need for the government to support business, support jobs, support incomes linked to the need for people to comply with the restrictions the government was implementing?
Yes, I think the notion of compliance with the restrictions became more important as the restrictions evolved and as the pandemic progressed for longer, because some of the advice was about fatigue and people's willingness to comply with restrictions that endured. I think actually the notion of compliance was less of a worry at that point, because I think there was evidence that people were isolating before they were required to do so. So there was a lot of sort of spontaneous behaviour anyway, because people were very worried about the virus and the health implications. So it was less about people won't comply unless we give this support, more that an assumption that people would probably comply, and that if they complied and we didn't give the support, businesses would fail, people would not be able to, would lose their jobs, would not be able to afford to live, and so on.
Yeah. And does that in part explain why you weren't waiting for the Prime Minister to announce further social restrictions to start your planning, because you were assuming anyway that people were naturally starting to modify their behaviour, that would have an effect on the economy in any event?
Yes, although my recollection is that even by the 16th, when there was the work from home if you can, don't go to pubs and restaurants, I think at that point we had a good understanding of what the next level of restrictions would be and how quickly they might come. So it was also needing to have that support in place ahead of the announcement of the lockdown in order to give people confidence. And I definitely recall people who were leading on the design of the CJRS saying that the response from businesses to the announcement on the 20th that the scheme would exist was many people calling them, business owners in tears because they were really worried that they would otherwise have had to lay off their staff, and they now no longer had to because the government was stepping in such a significant way to pay the wages of ultimately millions of workers.
I just want to pick up on something about how this was all possible from a delivery perspective. And if this is outside your core competence, then do say. But we've heard evidence about this unique relationship, really, between the Treasury and Revenue and Customs.
Yep.
You had been in the forerunner to Revenue and Customs. And we've heard it explained that that's in part because HMRC doesn't have a minister and the two work closely together. But how important was it that you had the ability to formulate policy and have those who are responsible for delivery working alongside you?
It was completely essential, and that policy partnership, and I've worked in it on both sides of the divide, I think was really critical to understanding it's not just how can you deliver what you want, but what can you deliver that might have the outcomes you hope. So it was very much an iterative process, and I think it's one which it predated the pandemic. Obviously, it was tested and used to a degree that is very unusual by the pandemic, but having HMRC, who are experts in delivery and who deliver tax policy and other policies for the government at pace regularly, but having them say, this is how we could do what you want to do, which might not have been the way that we as policy advisors would necessarily have thought was the best way of doing it, but they would say, this is the information we have, these are the systems we have, this is how we can build it, this is how quickly we can get it up and running. And that drove a lot of our decision making, and it did lead in some places to where HMRC, for example, didn't have information. It made it harder to do things. But I think that that partnership and the fact that actually it was one of the benefits of everyone working remotely was it was much easier because the culture had become that every meeting was virtual. It's much easier to both have a larger meeting, but also to have what otherwise were geographically disparate members of HMRC on calls with the Chancellor. I interacted with them particularly because later in 2020, when the health restrictions were becoming more regional in nature, HMRC needing to understand how do we tell whether a business is allowed to be open or is forced to be closed in order that we know what economic support they're entitled to and whether we need to do compliance work because someone who said that they'd been forced to be closed actually aren't forced to be closed in this particular area. So that interaction of where the health restrictions were going was also part of the interaction between the Treasury and HMRC.
Okay. Now, appreciate you've moved on, but you may still have a passing interest in the machinery of government. So that policy partnership, you've spoken about all the positives about it. Could that be developed elsewhere in government in terms of a future emergency to bring together that delivery and policy?
So I think it works in other departments as well, and definitely the relationship with DWP was very strong. I think part of the difference is this point about ministerial oversight, that the minister with responsibility for HMRC is a Treasury minister. It's the Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury, currently is the minister responsible for HMRC, and that having a single political leadership facilitates some of that. There is also a kind of systems thing, and the fact that when working physically together, HMRC's office is next to the Treasury's or one of their London offices. But I do think it could definitely be developed further, although I would say that with DWP, who were the other big delivery department for a lot of the economic support schemes, it was very, very effective, and it was very, very effective again in 2022 when responding to the cost of living, the energy crisis. So I think it is it can work elsewhere, but you have to have ministers that are willing to work together in that way, where there are not different ministers for between HMRC and the Treasury. It's the same set.
And in any future crisis, we don't necessarily know which departments are going to be most involved.
Yes. It depends entirely on the nature of the crisis.
All right, thank you. I want to move on to a slightly, a different topic. Policy coordination between MPIs and the economic response. And I'm just going to illustrate that with some questions about the economic response to a second wave. And I'm going to ask that the corporate memory project's put up again. So INQ 000 652988, this time page 4. And the penultimate bullet at the bottom of page 4, please, if we could have that highlighted. Dan noted final act was November lockdown. Towards the end, it was a bit more about explaining the economic support available, as the Chancellor had set out on a path in the summer of withdrawing the economic support on the basis that the seasonal resurgence would be smaller, and we'd managed with the COVID secure guidelines and 2-metre rule. And then the next bullet, please. Dan noted the Treasury was playing catch-up from September onwards with the reality of the pandemic, and therefore having to extend the support at short notice. Now, again, I'll give you an opportunity, first of all. Do you accept that that captures your reflections at the time?
I wouldn't say it entirely does. I definitely, and I think in my additional written statement for this module, covered this a little bit. I think the period of September and October, in particular, there was this desire that I talked about to take a more regional approach, a more geographically restricted approach to restrictions with what became the tiering and so on, and that the Treasury was seeking to make the economic support schemes that existed for a world where the restrictions were national work in that situation. And there was lots of discussion about, a substantial meal and various things, and whether that meant you could be open or closed. Partly because I think one of the Treasury's worries at the time, the Chancellor's worries, and I should say that there's a bit of using the terms interchangeably, and I think in a way which doesn't, I think, happen so much with other government departments. Obviously, all of these decisions were the Chancellor's. The Treasury would advise and provide analysis, but I think the two terms end up being a bit more interchangeable than I think they should be. But one of the worries from the very first period was that the economic impact had been bigger of the first lockdown than anticipated, because people who could not work from home and sectors where working from home was impossible, like, for example, construction, had shut more than was required by the rules. And therefore, in the autumn, we wanted to make sure that the economic support aligned with what the health restrictions were. So if the health restrictions said you should be closed, you got more support than if the health restrictions said that you didn't have to be closed. And to try and have a more nuanced approach, I think that was reflected both in the health approach, where we had there were lockdowns in areas of the northwest of England, very small geographical areas in the northwest of England in September. And I think what September and October showed was that because of developments in the virus, that kind of regional approach just didn't work. And I think that is my reflection on this period, that the Treasury was following that more regionally specific set of restrictions, but the reality was the virus was not behaving in a way which worked with those restrictions, and the idea that COVID secure guidelines, and there was lots of work in the summer on so-called smarter NPIs and issues like masks and so on. Those were not actually having the impact that anyone believed they were having, and the strategy changed very substantially at the end of October. And I think having spent months designing a set of interventions to work for regional tiering, open and closed sectors, that all had to be reversed at the end of October. And I do think that led to worse economic outcomes for businesses taking decisions on the basis that there would be no CJRS and we would move to the job support scheme. Because the health restrictions changed to be national, that plan had to change.
So would you say then that this wasn't the Treasury being out of step with the health restrictions, rather it was the Treasury trying to do the best for the economy it could, as against the health restrictions that were in place at the time?
Yeah.
So trying to restore as many parts of the economy as it could. But then when things changed because of the virus, the Treasury strategy had to change in step with it to, for example, when we went into the second lockdown.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. That at all times the economic support schemes were trying to work for a given set of NPIs. Given the pace at which the NPIs began to change again in the autumn, that just didn't work.
Just want to pick up one other topic briefly, and then I'm going to give you an opportunity just to share any reflections you have, having led that team, as to any improvements that could still be made or any observations you have about the future. It's just that this question about the devolved administrations. We're going to hear from Sir Charles Roxburgh, who accepts in his witness statement that in hindsight he could have done more with the devolved administrations. From your perspective, do you think there was sufficient consultation and that you could have done any more with the devolved administrations?
So I had fairly limited interactions with them. There was someone in the Scottish Government that I spoke to. I think that partly reflected the nature of my role, which was very much about coordinating within the Treasury and with the Cabinet Office. And so it wouldn't have been typical in my budget role for me to be leading on that. I think there was a lot of engagement, particularly on the public spending side of the Treasury, where that was one of the main routes via which some elements of economic support were sort of transmitted, where there was additional funding for the devolved governments. I think in general, on everything, more consultation is better. But I think the context was such that consultation comes with a cost in terms of the time that it takes and the people required to do it properly. And particularly in the early part of the pandemic, we had to move very, very quickly. And so had we done additional consultation, that might have delayed the ability to implement things. I think there was lots and lots of engagement on some of the schemes, although, again, I would say that's not something that I would have led on. It would have been for the people responsible for the schemes. But there was definitely a trade-off between consultation and more is always better, but there is a trade-off with pace.
Now, we've obviously dealt with a number of aspects of decision-making and how teams are resourced and so on and so forth. And you've spoken about some learning that's already been done. But do you have any other reflections looking back about developments for the future that could or should be considered?
I think some we've already talked about. I definitely think identifying very quickly someone to be responsible, where it's something which is novel and doesn't necessarily sit within a particular area of a particular department. I think one of the things that developed most over the course of the pandemic was actually the central decision-making architecture. And I think particularly from the point actually at which I stopped being involved, from November onwards, I really think that the COVID task force in the Cabinet Office had a much more orderly way of communicating about how decisions would be made, synthesizing the information from different parts of government about the implications and so on. I think, unfortunately, it's a consequence of just how quickly things moved in the spring that didn't happen in the best possible way. And I think there is a learning about this task force approach in the Cabinet Office, where it is something that requires lots of different bits of government to input, which would be, I think, very beneficial for a future crisis.
Thank you very much. Those are my questions. I think there are some participant questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Trout. Ms. Peaty, who's just there.
Thank you. Mr York-Smith, I ask questions on behalf of National Disabled People's Organisations. I'm going to ask you a few questions about the COVID Response Board, which I think you chaired, and in which you tell us coordinated equalities impact work. My question is, what specific input about equalities impact, including on disabled people, did the board contribute to submissions to ministers on proposed economic interventions that Treasury was either sort of putting forward or advising on?
So the board itself would not have produced the equalities impacts. That would have been for each individual scheme. And I'm certainly aware that what the board did consider and input to the Chancellor was about what we understood of the equalities impacts of the health restrictions and therefore the impact on particular sectors. So one example, which is not specifically about people with disabilities, but was about the impact of hospitality and leisure and the types of people who worked in those sectors. I do know that, for example, for the one that I'm aware of particularly is for the furlough scheme, that there was quite an extensive impact assessment given to the Chancellor about the impact on different protected groups. But I was not responsible for any of the schemes, so I'm not well placed to answer about what specific consideration was given to equalities impact on people with disabilities from any of the schemes.
Right, so it could have been in something that went up about a particular scheme, but you're saying there wasn't something more general about protected characteristics impact that was going to ministers from the board? So
for each scheme, there definitely would have been. What the thing that the board considered was the equalities impact and the impact on different protected groups of all of the health restrictions. I don't think it is something which is in my evidence proposal for this, but certainly I'm aware that it has been considered in a previous module.
So yes, so again, so that's the MPIs, but
yes.
Not economic interventions.
Not in totality. It would have been done scheme by scheme because the schemes all work differently and their impacts would all have been different.
And the Chancellor, in his statement, says he didn't receive readouts from the board or attend its meetings. So in the absence of that attendance, I understand the Chancellor is very busy, but that attendance or receiving readouts, did the Chancellor and other Treasury ministers receive details of the board and sub-board's analysis directly in any written form?
Yes, because the board itself was not a decision-making forum. It was a forum by which people shared information about the policy work they were doing, the analysis they were doing. All of that policy work and analysis would ultimately have ended up in a submission to the Chancellor. As I say, I'm definitely aware the Chancellor received something about MPIs. I can't say whether what he received for each individual scheme because both I don't recall, but I wouldn't have been responsible for any of those. I wasn't responsible for any of those schemes. Right.
So we'd have to check those individual documents.
Yes.
As I've said, in relation to the COVID Response Board which you chaired and which coordinated that equalities impact work, what external input did the board seek and receive, including from external equalities bodies and representative organisations such as disabled people's organisations, which are majority-led, staffed and governed by disabled people as distinct from charities, to inform its strategy and analysis?
So, and I probably should have said this in answer to one of your earlier questions, the COVID Response Board didn't coordinate equalities analysis.
Oh, right. So, I understood your statement said that it coordinates coordinated equalities impact work. I think that's at 110 of your statement, but is that not the case?
No, that is not the case. It would have been one of the things that it talked about, but it would not have coordinated it because it was a meeting which brought together lots of subject matter experts, one of which would have been the team that is responsible for producing equalities analysis, but that team sat in a different part of the Treasury to mine. So I'm afraid I can't speak to what consultation they did. The board itself was a purely internal structure about information sharing.
Right, so that's at a team level. So were you aware of any structure above that team that coordinated equalities impact work within the Treasury?
Yes, there is a team called the Labour Markets Analysis and Distributional Impact Team, which produces equalities analysis and also trains other teams how to consider equalities impacts in their policy work.
And is that specific to labour market interventions?
No, it's they do both labour markets and distributional and equalities impacts. The two happen to sit together, but it's not just on the labour market, no.
And I think if we, looking at what the COVID Response Board covered, I think in June 2020, is it right that there was a reference to focus on equalities? Is it enough? And what can we do to centralise equalities as a key policy driver? Do you remember that being a matter that was discussed at the board and what happened in response?
So I do think that there was a discussion about the equalities impact of NPIs, as I say. I don't think it was about the impact of the schemes, but I can't really recall.
Was it not something important for the board to look at the equalities impact of those schemes, not only of the NPIs, in a more general way?
Given the nature of the board, I don't think it was. It was something which the Chancellor would have been advised. It wasn't necessarily something which the board itself would have discussed at length because the Chancellor was receiving the advice directly. I'm possibly not explaining very well how the board worked and what its particular role was, but it wasn't a gateway to the Chancellor and it didn't consider everything. It was, as I say, primarily about sharing information so all the different teams working on the COVID response and the individual schemes had the same set of information about what was happening with the restrictions in particular, the economy. So it's possible that it did, but I'm afraid I can't recall exactly to what extent it did.
And my next question is a bit more about those policy teams. You refer to in your statement to the Equality Policies Team and the Equality and Living Standards Analysis Team, which I understand to be two separate teams, and say that those provided advice and guidance to policy teams and created, the corporate statement from HMT goes further and explains that those teams provided advice and guidance and created analytical tools such as the Equalities Explorer dashboard. What equalities analysis did you receive from those teams?
So it would be the kind of thing that I've talked about in terms of, I'm afraid I'm going to focus on the non-pharmaceutical interventions because that was the thing that I was more involved in. But the second of those teams it's not a team, it's a part of that labour markets and distributional analysis team. They have a bit of that team which does equalities and living standards analysis. I am sure that I saw in advice to the Chancellor the outputs of their analysis, but I'm afraid I can't give specific examples other than I know that Rishi Sunak's witness statement talks specifically about the equalities analysis that he received on the introduction of the furlough scheme, the CGRS.
So I suspect your answer will be the same, that you didn't use the work of those teams directly in your role as chair of the COVID Response Board.
I will have seen it, but I think yeah.
And just to be clear, in relation to the Equality and Living Standards Analysis Team, which you mention, is it in fact the case that that wasn't formed until 2021? I don't think we know the date in 2021, so that wouldn't have been a team that had any input or that you could have drawn on during your tenure as chair of the COVID Response Board.
So I think my best recollection is that the Treasury decided to increase the amount of resource that it had to conduct such analysis, but there were people doing that analysis before. This wider labour markets and distribution analysis team, which produces lots of impact analysis on the impact on incomes in the household distribution and equalities analysis, they have existed before, but there was a decision in 2021 to increase the amount of resource available in that team and also on the public services side of Treasury, which is where a lot of those impacts are felt. But it did exist before then because analysis was produced in 2020 about, as the one that I am certain about is about the furlough scheme.
And that dashboard, in fact, wasn't launched until spring 2023, so even after her ladyship's terms of reference. Is that right?
I'm afraid I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms Beattie. That completes the questions we have for you, Mr York-Smith. I know you've helped us before. Thank you very much indeed for all the help you've given to the inquiry and to your former colleagues who I suspect had a hand in helping you with the witness statement and the like. So thank you again, and I shall resist the temptation to ask what this week has been like. Thank you. I shall take the break now. Oh, you've got the restriction order.
Yes, please. Sorry, my fault. 13:45 or thereabouts, restriction order, please, for the transcript and the live feed. I mentioned the name of the author of the Corporate Memory Project.
Certainly. I shall return at 3 o'clock. All right. Ms Wilson.
My lady, may I please call Dr. Ben Warner?
Much repeated to me. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Let's take a seat.
Welcome back, Dr Warner.
Thank you.
Dr. Warner, thank you for attending and assisting the inquiry again today. You've provided a second witness statement to this module of the inquiry with reference number INQ 000 657 617, which is signed and dated the 13th of October 25. Is that correct?
Yes.
I want to start by asking you, please, about data science capabilities across government. The context of that is you were appointed to the civil service as a special advisor in December of 29. Is that correct? Sorry,
Yes.
2019. Is that correct? You had a broad remit, effectively working to provide support in the field of data science across government.
Yes, although actually a lot of my work was on data infrastructure, how we collected data, so the whole processing from the whole of that, the requirements to get to data science, not just data science.
So digital data,
Yes.
data science.
Exactly.
Okay. And why is all of that important in a fast-paced emergency like a pandemic?
I think that sort of stuff is important in the modern world.
We heard this morning from Mr. Benford that having good capabilities in those areas helps with an agile but also an efficient response. Do you agree?
I think technology helps organisations be efficient, whether in a crisis or in normal times.
And is it also right that you work to support individual departments to improve their capabilities in those fields?
Where I could work with departments, I definitely did.
And in order to provide an assessment of a department's capability, you would require information from that department and to work closely with them. Is that right?
I never carried out that type of assessment.
Okay. Can we look at two departments, please, relevant to the economic response? The first one is the former Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, BEIS. What was your view as to their data science, data technology capabilities?
In Mike Keoghan, I think they had a very good leader who cared deeply about trying to improve how we thought about analysis and data science in government. And then Luke Pereira, who reported to him, there was a good leader of that data science team. I'd known them before I joined government and had been impressed by their efforts. And so when I joined government, I'd often speak to them about how they had managed to be successful in government and the lessons learned.
Yes, I think you mentioned in your statement that you look to BEIS to learn, and the individuals who worked in there, to learn the lessons of their successes. What were the lessons that you learned from that?
I think it'd be better to ask them. Given it's been 5 years, I wouldn't be able to tell you what exactly they would say.
A couple of features picked out from other evidence we've received included that it had several data scientists. It was very quick to install a multidisciplinary data science team. Are those sorts of features which you also observed?
Yeah, I think those are the sort of things that they did.
And what about work in relation to real-time indicators on the economic response? to the
I think I spoke to them briefly about that work, and I think they would send me their work and talk to me about their work, yes, during the pandemic.
Did you find departments, including BEIS, receptive to your support across government?
Across government, I think lots of people were both receptive but also very helpful for me. In pushing forward the digital and data agenda, there was lots of people across government who really sort of provided support, provided help, resources to try and help a whole of government effort to try and improve.
Moving now to ask you about your observations on the Treasury, on digital and data and technology. You were introduced to the Treasury via an official in number 10. I think if we can pull up, please, INQ 000654319. This is an email from Stuart Glassborough, who was based in number 10, but I understand he was seconded from the Treasury. Is that right?
I think, I don't know whether Stuart was seconded, but he worked in number 10 during the time I was in COVID.
Thank you. And we can see this email here, which is sent to Claire Lombardelli, the Chief Economic Advisor during the pandemic, introducing you and the work that you've done to the Treasury. Broadly, were the Treasury receptive to the support which you offered them?
I would say that in my interactions, Treasury were the least receptive of the government departments.
Why do you think that was?
I don't know.
Thank you. That document can be taken down. Can I ask you, please, about your observations about the Treasury's capabilities in digital and data and technology?
Specifically in digital and data and technology, they did not have, I believe, a digital and data or technology team. And by that, I mean a team that can build out either modern data infrastructure or technological products.
We've heard from Mr. Benford this morning, who acknowledged that even by the time he was enrolled in November 20, there was a lack of data science strategy, but also nobody in the position of a chief data officer. There was also things which you observed.
Yes.
And how do you think that impacted on the economic response to the pandemic?
I think that having modern data systems and analytical capabilities to go alongside that will only help improve decision making.
Did you see, I understand you left your role as a special advisor in May 21, didn't you?
Yes.
Did you see any improvement in that capability in the Treasury over your time there?
During my time in number 10, I worked less with the Treasury towards the end. I do know that they had stood up a data science hub, and I believe actually 10DS and the people working in 10DS, which I'm not leading at this point, Laura Gilbert is leading, were supporting those efforts, but I'm not heavily involved.
So because you were unable to work with the Treasury that closely, and like you say, you weren't heavily involved, was it difficult to assess their capabilities across the pandemic?
I obviously can assess only what I saw during the pandemic and where I interacted with the Treasury. I wouldn't want to make broad arching statements as to the whole of the capability or capacity of the Treasury in these different areas.
I understand in October of 2020, you, along with colleagues, carried out an analytical review. Can we have that on the screen, please? It's INQ 000196003. The review of this is a review of consensus statements, isn't it? I think.
So I believe that what I've tried to do here is I talk to a large number of people across the analytical and science establishment, and different departments, to try and get an idea of what the major problems, the frictions and things that we could improve upon. And then the idea of this statement is to bring it together into one piece of paper that everyone could sort of agree to.
Thank you. And you identify some of those difficulties, including spending decisions and procurement creates friction in the system. Can you explain what's meant by that, please?
Yes, so as you can see in the recommendation, you can see I speak to an analytical structure. And by this I mean who is in charge in government of being able to say, okay, we're going to spend a large amount of money on a study. So if you take, for example, the ONS infection study, that is a really good piece of analytical work that was covered out in government, going from data collection all the way to building out a graph that the Prime Minister can make decisions on. But it's a substantial amount of spending. If we were to say, for instance, okay, well, we want a similar study to understand where infections are occurring, who would be the person to make that decision? How would we get the budget and the approval to actually do that? And this is what I'm talking about in the spending decisions. We're at this point in time when I talk to people who were involved in trying to procure public surveys of the public behaviour and public attitudes to our response in COVID, they spoke to how they were struggling to be able to procure surveys at that point, and that the process was too slow. And so the point we're making here is that a lot of both the decisions on what we to spend money on and then actually being able to spend that money to gain the data or the information or the tools or technology we needed was too slow, and that was causing frictions, so slowdown in the system.
Thank you. Another comment made in this document is that a large amount of work feels almost adversarial, health versus economic, rather than bringing together into a single view. Can you elaborate on that, please?
I think that the best analytical work is always done when you bring together things at a low level and bring different information from different sectors to be able to bring it together into a single systematic view. And I think we weren't doing that. What we were ending up with is a pack on one item, a pack on another item, so a siloed approach. Yeah. And I think that creates the impression it's adversarial, whereas it's not.
And in terms of it being adversarial, does that contribute to a low trust environment amongst those teams?
I don't think, here I think that I'm using adversarial to mean sort of against each other, rather than adversarial as we might use it in relation to two different groups discussing.
We've heard this morning about the work of the Directorate General for Analysis, which helped to bring together different perspectives on analysis into a single team to put forward a single picture of analysis. Did you support the work of that team?
I think if you look to this document being written in September, and then you look at the work that Rob Harrison carried out through the time I was in Number 10, you can see that he actually managed to solve and actually bring together a number of these different and solve a number of these different problems.
So do you agree a team such as that is essential in any future crises?
I think that we have to be building a systematic approach always. Indeed, in my time in Number 10, we worked on how we could bring together different teams. It's just not about analysis, it's about people who are experts in policy, in delivery, in law, bring together different people from multidisciplinary teams to be able to apply that to the problem. So that's the case both in crisis, but also just in government.
Thank you. I want to ask you now about a topic which we've already heard a little bit about today, the use of a toy model by both the analysis team but also in Treasury. Now, as I understand it, this was a simplistic model which was used to improve the commissioning process to SPI-M. Is that right?
I believe that over time people thought that it could be used for the commissioning process of SPI-M.
Can we have, please, INQ 000654337 on the screen? Thank you. This was an email sent from you to Rob Harrison on the 12th of January 21, after there'd been some use of the toy model, where you say, I think HMT analysts are on the wrong side of this one. What did you mean by that?
By this, I mean that I disagree with the point of view that HMT analysts are taking.
What was happening? What point of view?
Actually, the attachments to this document are around vaccine rollout and the impact of vaccine rollout. So this document could be referring to, I think, that HMT analysts believe that vaccine rollout will have a different effect to where I think the consensus view of the scientific expertise is, or that the HMT analysts are using the toy model to, or there are maybe whatever tools they are using to create the wrong impression within the Treasury as to the impact of vaccines.
So did you have some concerns about how the toy model was being used by the Treasury?
You can see in my statement that I refer to these concerns.
Can you just briefly explain what those concerns were?
Well, as you can see in my statement, Patrick Vallance says that along the lines of use of this toy model in this way might lead to misleading information for decision makers.
And could we also have on screen, please, INQ 000196028? Thank you. This is an email from Angela McLean, who's one of the stakeholders of the toy model, I believe, who'd sent an email saying, I've emailed Chris and Patrick saying HMT changed the model after I QA'd it, and I don't know how. She then goes on to say, be very critical about her view of HMT's modelling and that the approach has no endorsement from me. Were those concerns you shared?
My concerns are because I have a great amount of respect and trust in Angela. She was incredibly useful, incredibly helpful in her advice she proposed to me in COVID. When somebody like that sends an email like that, I think that anyone should be concerned.
This was obviously an issue where there was a number of different viewpoints, and it was a sensitive issue, wasn't it? Because there was a lot of concern about the risk of using the toy model in a particular way. Is that right?
I think that we were always striving to come up with the best possible answers and being able to solve the problems that decision makers had about how the possible trends or scenarios that the epidemic would go, how it would propagate. My opinion was always that it was better putting an expert like Angela McCain in front of the Chancellor or the PM so she could answer the questions, rather than simply giving them some sort of model that doesn't really represent the real world. Indeed, that's why I introduced Angela McCain directly to the PPS of the Chancellor.
In fact, there was a positive outcome, as I understand it, in that there was a commission drawn up which went to SPI-M to ask particular questions to assist the Chancellor. Is that right?
I think that I wouldn't necessarily say that's a positive outcome. There were always commissions going to SPI-M. The question would be...
Sorry, rather than using the toy model to come up with those answers.
I don't know if that... I mean, a commission is always going to SPI-M, asking questions. Whether the toy model helped in answering better questions or not, I have no opinion on, or I don't know, because I wasn't involved in writing that commission.
This was quite a tense issue, wasn't it, amongst the analysts and in particular the Treasury. There was a strong feeling about how the Treasury used it. Is that fair?
I think that because of the nature of where we are in the collaboration between the COVID analysis, the task force and HMT, where HMT are getting more involved, there is more documentation and more interaction. Yeah. But actually, I wouldn't say that this is the tensest of issue. It's just because it's a visible issue.
How was this issue resolved within the Directorate General of Analysis team?
I'm not the right person to answer that question.
Do you agree that it's an example of how the Directorate General brought different perspectives together when previously there might have been a slight tension between two competing views about an issue?
I think it is a good example of how, over time, Rob did a really good job of starting to bring Treasury into the tent and how that helped to make better decisions.
Thank you. Dr. Warner, just one final question from me. Do you have any additional, other than those helpfully set out in your statement, do you have any additional observations or reflections you'd like to share with the inquiry?
I think that it's really important that we realise that to build out good analytical structures, we need very good analytical leaders, and we need to give them the support and empower them. I think that, you know, what we see is when Rob Harrison, who has the right capabilities, joins the COVID task force, it makes a massive difference. And I think that we need to make sure that we can further empower those people. And then actually, if you look at that consensus statement that we read out earlier, it's also about making sure that there is enough capacity in those teams. Often in COVID, the analysts were trying to do their best job, but they were just sort of hand to mouth at times. And so how we can build out both the capability and the capacity in government to be able to do the analysis that needs to be done, whether in a crisis or in business as usual, I think is crucial.
Thank you, Dr. Warner. Those are all my questions, my lady.
I have no questions, and there are no other questions to be asked. Thank you very much for your help, Dr. Warner. I'm sorry that you had to wait till the end of the day.
No worries. Thank you.
Very well. I shall return at 10:30 on Monday, the 1st of December. Thank you.